This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. This talk is with Sonia Massai, professor of Shakespeare and Early Modern Studies at King's College, London. Sonia has served as Vice Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's College and was recently appointed an Order of Merit Officer of the Italian Republic. This talk will focus on her many contributions to Shakespeare scholarship and to the theater arts. If you are watching us on YouTube and wish to listen to this program as a podcast, you may click the link below to your favorite podcast platform. If you are joining us via a podcast and wish to watch this program, we are available on YouTube under the search term, Speaking of Shakespeare. This series is funded with institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Sonia, it is so good to see you, to get you on the program.
Pleasure.
I have a lot of questions for you. I have enough questions for you to last for hours and hours that you don't have, because I'm looking here at your record and the enormous amount of work that you've done. And I'm going to try to prioritize things that are recent. And so what I want to do is to start with your latest book. But first, I want to kind of give an overview of your work. You present, I just spoke with Shoichiro Kawai, Professor Shoichiro Kawai of the University of Tokyo, and he talks about his work being lined up in a trinity. And you seem to have a trinity here also in Shakespeare and early modern drama, editing and book history, and also in theater studies. And you work these three angles. And your most recent book is fascinating. I managed to get to read some of it. It's about accents in Shakespeare. And just if you could lead with that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you first of all, for having me on this series. And yes, by all means, Shakespeare's accents. I don't know if anybody has ever wondered why Shakespeare tends to sound so posh. English is not my first language, so I've always been especially sensitive, I think, to how English sounds. And it struck me as peculiar that no one I ever come across spoke in that kind of clipped and crisp accent that you hear on kind of traditional English-speaking stages. And so I wondered where that voice, that very specific, peculiar Shakespeare voice, was coming from historically and socially and culturally. And so I started researching this topic, also with a very personal investment in the topic, because English is not my first language. And so I've always been very aware of the fact that I speak English with an accent. My first language is Italian. And in fact, I started learning English when I was quite old. I was already a teenager, and I learned English discontinuously. Then I picked it up again at university. And by the time I moved to the UK to do my postgraduate studies, I could write an essay in English, but I struggled even to get understood on the bus, at a time when we still used to pay for fares on boarding a bus. And I got stared at, and I got repeatedly asked, what my destination was. So for me, the clarity of pronunciation, the connotations carried by accents have always had a very personal significance. And so I started this project with a lot of interest, professional interest, but also personal investment. And I made so many discoveries along the way. And I hoped that the readers of the book may not be aware or may not have been aware either of all those times in history, in the history of the reception of Shakespeare in the theatre, when accent really mattered. So the accent in which Shakespeare was spoken on stage at key times during the history of the reception caused quite literally outrage. And the outrage in turn led to change, both in the theatre and the arts world, but also in society at large. So I can give you maybe a couple of examples. I was especially surprised to find that contrary to still dominant wisdom about what Shakespeare and his actors might have sounded like, I found that they didn't sound as gutsy and popular and therefore kind of accessible as some scholars suggest, but that in fact they were reprimanded for trying to sound better than they were. So for using an accent that at the time was used as usual speech, which would be the equivalent of today's received pronunciation. So the accent spoken by the educated elite. And so they were reprimanded for not only looking other than they were, so for wearing luxurious costumes and props that suggested that they were kings and queens, and therefore lying about their status, but also for sounding better than they were. And that it came across as for me as a genuine kind of discovery and surprise. And the same applies to later periods. I was really intrigued and amused to find out that one of the most famous Shakespearean actors of all times, David Garrick, was haunted all his life by critics who noticed and frowned upon his Midlands accent. So one of the great stars, one of the great actors of all times, to some sounded indecorous and inappropriate. But at the same time, the fact that Garrick was not classically trained, he didn't sound like a classically trained actor, sparked an incredible nationwide movement that was patronizingly described as spouting, which describes a kind of an uncouth way of delivering Shakespeare's lines across the country, of amateur actors who reclaimed the right to speak Shakespeare in public. Because post-1660, from the restoration of the English monarchy and the reopening of the theatres onwards, up until the theatre reform of the 19th century, only licensed companies, and there were very few, and most of them in central London, were allowed to speak Shakespeare. And they did so in a very kind of controlled accent, in a kind of very conventional voice. So that book has been a labor of love, has led me to making what were for me genuine discoveries, and I hope that that enthusiasm comes across for readers who may also not be as familiar with the history of the sound of Shakespeare on stage.
Well, I think you have not stumbled upon, you are in an area that is of eternal intrigue through cultures. I'm in Japan, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Of course, in Italy, I'm certain that you can tell if someone is from Genoa or from Rome. It's probably abundantly clear. I grew up in the American South and had to struggle a bit in academe because the American Southern accent sometimes is associated with bad things, including not being very smart. And maybe they're right about that, but I found that I just naturally changed, and you may have gone through that even in your native tongue in Italy. You know, once entering in the university, that sort of thing. We've all had to go through this accent thing. Now you point out, and I'm trying desperately now to remember the name of the sort of original person who started OP. I'm very familiar with David Crystal's work. Ben Crystal, his son, is a friend of the program and a good friend of mine. And so we'll talk about them in a second, but who was it you pointed in your introduction to an article or an effort by someone in the 1930s, who began the OP, or original pronunciation.
Thank you, Tom, for noticing that. That was another epiphany. I came across this woman called Mary Hope Allen, and she was a
Yes,
pioneer.
Mary
And
Hope. How could I forget Mary Hope Allen? What a
Mary Hope
great name.
Allen.
Yeah.
She was a wonderful, very creative, super smart producer, one of the first women producers for the BBC. Well, radio was a new medium, so it offered new opportunities for women who could not get jobs in more kind of established institutional sectors in the arts world or media and communication. And she used original pronunciation not as an exercise of acoustic archaeology. So she wasn't interested in establishing how Shakespeare originally sounded, but she used OP to diversify that received pronunciation accent that was used on stage to reach out to a more diverse audience, the kind of wider audiences that radio was reaching at that time. And you can tell from the way in which the programs are presented in the Radio Times, but also from existing recordings in the archives of the BBC, that the tone was playful. And the approach was, imagine if you were back in Elizabethan London and you go back home after a hard day's work, and you kick off your boots and sit back and enjoy your ale and switch on the radio. What would you hear on the radio? And so there were bits of late 16th century news, and kind of news reports, and extracts of the plays. Twelfth Night was very popular. They broadcast extracts from Twelfth Night twice, and in OP. And the way in which these programs were presented stressed the fact that that was our best guess. That they were interested not so much in authenticity as in just playing around with voices and sounds. And apparently this program was so popular that were adapted for children and broadcast again subsequently for a younger audience. And I am so grateful to Julia Mannheim. There's a shout out for Julia, Mary's niece, who donated Mary's papers to the University of Cambridge library.
Yeah.
And I was able to access some of Mary's papers through, because Julia had the good sense of depositing all her correspondence and notebooks at the University Library in Cambridge.
Yes.
And Julia also has shared with me quite a few personal anecdotes and memories of Mary. And I think Mary is one of those actually women producers that the BBC should make more of. I started approaching a BBC producer, and then the pandemic happened, so everything kind of came to a standstill. But it's still a kind of pet project of mine, an offshoot from the book, if you like, that I would like to pursue, because Mary deserves to be better known. A legacy is so important, because you could say that the whole book is about foregrounding diverse voices. So my work is inevitably attuned to larger changes in the academy, but beyond the academy as well. I'm interested in diversity. I want to unearth histories of diversity. And while other colleagues have done amazing work in, for example, early modern critical race studies, religion, ethnicity, all those aspects of our being human that makes us different. I'm interested in acoustic diversity, and I think it really deserves attention. And it has started to attract the attention of some really smart, creative theatre directors. So now Shakespeare sounds more diverse than it used to 10 or 15 years ago. And you find more directors now are curating voices.
Did you get to see any of the productions they put on a few years back now? They did Romeo and Juliet at the Globe, I believe, and I think the Crystals were sort of involved with that. Were you able to see that production or any of those?
And it was so interesting, again, in the spirit of Mary's work.
How was it in terms of, to your ear, was it recognizable, or did you know?
Yes. I think there is this preconception that OP is impenetrable, and it's not. It takes a little bit to tune in. But it takes just as long to tune in to Shakespeare performed in RP. And so after a few minutes, you get used to the slightly different accent, and you just start to relax, and you enjoy the fact that this is a different Shakespeare that doesn't sound like a modern day regional Shakespeare.
Right.
I think it's important to recognize it's an experiment, and we don't know whether Shakespeare actually sounded as it does today in OP. I'm pretty sure that if Shakespeare was able to listen in, he probably wouldn't immediately recognize it himself as entirely familiar, because there's a margin of guesswork. But it's really interesting because by experimenting with accent and voices, you get to hear different things. Different rhyming patterns, different meanings are activated by the way in which you pronounce keywords. And so it's but just basically really enjoyable. There's a really interesting line of research among psychologists, but also historical linguists, that has proved, I think, quite definitely that there is nothing inherently obscure about regional accents compared to, or foreign accents compared to standard accent. It's just familiarity. And so, because it just takes a bit to tune in, as I was saying before, you tend to think that maybe a regional accent is uncouth and therefore obscure. It's just a little different. And fair enough. I mean, some accents, if you're not familiar with them, are absolutely impenetrable. So we're not talking about a pure regional accent that verges onto a different dialect. We're talking about English spoken in accents that are still kind of recognizable, just unfamiliar.
Well, that really takes us into the theater, doesn't it? And also the theater and beyond. I want to seize upon one key word there, acoustic, key term, acoustic diversity. And I am extraordinarily interested in the soundscapes of early modern London, and particularly at St. Paul's Cathedral, that sort of thing. I followed that very closely. And also the theater, of course, and that's been written on quite a lot and very excellently by several scholars. But you're digging in a little bit further here with accents that pretty quickly, and I probably shouldn't bring up a recent movie, but Spike Lee has done a recent movie entitled Black Klansman, and it stars Denzel Washington. What a fabulous actor, right? His son, and his son speaks basically throughout the movie in a white accent. Right. And he says, I can do jive and I can do white in the movie. I'm quoting the movie. And it's a true story. But he taught this person who became a police officer in Colorado, taught himself how to speak white, and actually fooled the Klan over the phone into thinking that he was a white racist. Right. It was a brilliant movie. I don't want to do it as a spoiler alert. It's a couple of years old, but anything now that is a couple of years old is really only a year old, because we sort of missed a year in there, haven't we? But well, it's very readable. I wanted to, this is very readable. And everything that you do is very readable, but there's a lot of your work that belongs to the scholarship that basically you have to be fairly well briefed on what is going on in the year 1604 or the year 1756. You know, if you mention Garrick, you have to key, 18th century and, bring in, I can do that because that's what I can do, right? I'm no good at fishing for trout or fly fishing. I haven't practiced that, but I have looked into the other things. So this is a very readable book, and it's one you can pick off the shelf, and it's very interesting, the amount that I've been able to get on preview, because we're still, a supply chain is still a little bit slow in getting books over here. Your work, you've done such an enormous amount of work. I feel that we have to get to, we have to move from accents that I could spend the rest, I mean, really just for hours, talking about wartime Shakespeare. You're on a grant, and wartime. Now, if I'm thinking of Sonia Massai, I'm not thinking that she's going to run towards war as a topic, right? And what is this about? What can we expect from wartime Shakespeare?
It's part and parcel of my interest in the afterlife of Shakespeare. So uses of Shakespeare over time. And this is also a collaborative project. My postdoctoral research assistant, Amy Litster, she's very much in the driving seat with me. And we found that we shared an interest in the history plays, and it's the history plays that often get revived at times of war. And so we came upon this kind of idea that intersects with my interest in the reception of Shakespearean performance. And so we put an application in with colleagues from war studies at King's College London, and I guess the funding body, the Liverhume, liked also the idea that we're collaborating across academic disciplines. And so the work we're doing has allowed us to nuance and change a bit the narrative of common sense of among scholars of how Shakespeare was mobilized at times of war. And I'm particularly excited by the fact that Amy is writing a new monograph, so mostly aimed at fellow scholars. But we're also co-editing an exhibition book and co-curating an exhibition that are going to launch and open simultaneously in autumn 2023. And the exhibition is going to be hosted by the National Army Museum in London, but it's also going to have a digital presence. And so we're going to reach a wider audience than other fellow scholars. And I find that really exciting, because people interested in war studies and people interested in Shakespeare don't usually meet.
No, they don't. And they should.
And they should, because actually there's so many overlaps. We found actually that people with a vested interest in war studies, or even high-ranking army generals and colonels who are now collaborating, have themselves used Shakespeare or turned to Shakespeare, either to inform opinion about any kind of given conflict, or a reading of any given conflict, kind of historically, so retrospectively from the present, looking back at the past. So this project is quite unusual. You very perceptibly picked up on the fact that it is like unusual for Sonia Massai to.
Yeah, it is. It is a little, but I understand now it fits, and I wasn't quite sure exactly how it fit. But could I say something like, well, let's take something very more recent in our minds. Let's say World War II, right? Yeah. Would you say, look at certain productions that came up during that time? Of course, Henry V, but how maybe Coriolanus, can you do this? Someone who defects and goes to the other side, and then, back and forth, whatever. Is that appropriate or whatnot? And you can see in your reception a sort of stock market of certain plays that are selected during times of global war, particularly world wars.
Absolutely. What Amy and I have found is that there was quite a dramatic shift in the use of Shakespeare across time. So we start from the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century, through the American War of Independence, Napoleonic Wars, Crimean Wars, 19th century, and then the two World Wars, all the way up to the Iraq War in present day. And each stage has a different story to tell. And what was interesting to find is that, yes, there are the usual suspects, Coriolanus, Henry V, but used in very nuanced ways. And one of the big surprises, to go back to the kind of serendipity of kind of research and what you didn't expect you would find, is that even though each period has a distinctive way of using Shakespeare, so in the 18th century and 19th century, you could say that Shakespeare was mobilized to engage in a battle of wits that was fought above and alongside, the kind of military conflict. So both sides of the conflict used Shakespeare to satirize and lampoon the other side. Then in the 20th century, with the world wars, to go back to your question, Shakespeare becomes a kind of more kind of patriotic. So he's mobilized to rally not just the soldiers, but the kind of civilians who are kind of also fighting the war back home, as it were, or supporting the war effort. But never with a single voice. So what we found is that Shakespeare Time of Wars is never used simplistically, either to support the war or to critique the war. There is a complexity that heightens the sensitivity to all the big questions raised by conflict. And more recently, we found that Shakespeare has been used both by theatre directors, but also by people who were active in service within the British Army, to question why a country was to war.
Yes.
And so there is a kind of resurgence in what is generally described as the just war tradition.
Yes.
We have one of our contributors is Tim Collins, who gave a speech that echoed very closely one of Henry V's monologues, as he kind of rallied his men on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. And Tim writes beautifully about how he used Shakespeare to make sure that his men knew what was about to happen, and that they cohered as a band of brothers. But Tim Collins doesn't wax lyrical about the aftermath of that conflict, and in fact, it's public knowledge that then he wrote quite critically about it, and then resigned from service, having still a huge kind of sense of duty and service. So is not his confidence in the purpose of the army itself, but in kind of the reasons for going to war in relation to a particular conflict. And so the complexity, this is the kind of complexity I was telling you about, that is not just on the part of scholars who are always looking out for complexity, is even someone like Tim, who needed to actually Shakespeare not to nuance, but to bolster the kind of sense of brotherhood among his men, some of whom he writes very emotionally about it, and never left home. Some of whom had never encountered death, not even in the family, because they were kind of still so young. And so he, as a leader of other men, wondered, how to make sure that they cohered to face huge risk for themselves personally, and really big questions for which there were no certain answers. Even then, there was a lot of uncertainty even when the war started. And so his sense of what Shakespeare is useful for is fascinating. As a Shakespeare scholar, I would never have guessed. So the rhetorical power of the language to lift and guide the kind of lift the spirits and guide and kind of lift the morale, but not without nuance, not without complexity.
Okay.
So
So these are commanders using Shakespeare with their troops
yeah,
in a type of training as part of their maybe emotional, the psychic training, getting young men ready to face battle, basically.
that's right.
Right.
That's right.
Oh, well, that's right there. That's in the ranks. I was thinking more of what might have been played in London, during the Napoleonic period or any period, but you're looking at within the ranks. It's so interesting. It brings up to my mind, and I may be wrong about this. It's been kind of years. It's a trouble with speaking to experts. But Troilus and Cressida, it's a rhetorical speech where he gives every reason for not going to war with the Greeks. Right. The conclusion obviously should be let's don't bother with this, right? Which they have the walls, they don't have to.
Yeah.
And then right after that they go, let's go. You just made the,
we have a wonderful contributor writing about Troilus and Cressida that was staged in London in 1938 as the country was preparing for another world war.
Yeah.
And Troilus and Cressida is a you could say is Shakespeare is never a manifesto, but you could say is a manifesto for questioning reason for going to war.
Yeah.
Is the most cynical and realistic, I guess, assessment of why people go to war.
Yeah, maybe not nihilistic too.
Totally, because nothing survives Troilus and Cressida, both love and war, two big ideals, honor and love, they get taken to pieces.
Yeah.
And so Troilus and Cressida, we didn't mention it earlier, but it's another play, along with maybe Henry V or Coriolanus, that gets revived when people feel really uncomfortable about why they're at war.
I thought of that speech 20 years ago. I'm American. The Iraq War. I thought, here are all these reasons laid out in any war room. Any intelligent people. Here are all the reasons not to go into Iraq. Right, and this is why it's a very bad idea. And I think Colin Powell, who recently has passed away, I think he said, if you break it, you own it. And there were all these warnings out there, and they said, okay, fine, thank you, let's go. It just, what is that? You could be very cynical and say it's to, pad the pockets of the right people with, the war machine, that sort of thing. I think that may have been part of it, but then there was just this instinct that.
I think it's fascinating that, something I didn't expect when we started on this project, when we started off, was the fact that Shakespeare generally provides a language with which we can grapple or encourage the wider community of producers, spectators, critics, just people who come across, these uses of Shakespeare times of war, to grapple with the complexity of the questions.
Yeah.
So for us, it wasn't the fact that at some point in time, Shakespeare was used for jingoistic purposes. At other times, he was used for pacifist purposes. The dominant narrative that has emerged from this project is that Shakespeare is, yes, used satirically, yes, used patriotically, but mostly used very subtly to develop this sense of critical distance from what's happening that is so traumatic, so frightening, it really taps on all the kind of big ethical questions, and Shakespeare seems to be used to help people grapple with those big questions.
Yeah, well, I think this is great, and I love hearing that there's going to be a curated display, and I hope that things are such that when this happens, I'll be able to get over and see it. Let's just hope for that. And so forth. Well, a large part of your career, and I'm moving down my list here, has to do with textual transmission, reception, and I am very big on reception. I think it's just a lot. And so you really have focused on we're going from your public face, really, you know, with the accents and warfare and the way that outreach and the way to show people how this is pertinent, you know, this to our lives and so forth, to an area that only the brave dare go, and that is transmission from manuscript into print. And that takes you into archives and into reading old handwriting and that kind of thing. You've worked a lot on book history and editing and textual transmission. And, you know, there's no way I can ask you to sum this up, but could you try to tell us
Happily,
some of what you found in doing this type of work? Yeah.
Well, as with the other projects, my interest was sparked by a question that I found really interesting, and I think everybody can relate, really. So the common understanding when I started working on the transmission of Shakespeare into print was that the first editor of Shakespeare, Nicholas Rowe, published his edition of the works in 1709, and that's the beginning of the editorial tradition. Yeah. And I would like to mention someone else. I mentioned Julia earlier. I would like to mention someone else, Tom Berger.
Everyone, mention everyone. Yeah.
Well, Tom had a very special role in my professional and personal life. He was initially an informal tutor of mine.
And this is who, I'm sorry, this is who again? I didn't hear.
Thomas Berger.
Thomas Berger, yes, of course, yes.
Thomas L. Berger.
Yes.
And then we became colleagues and collaborators. And it was Tom. When I started getting really interested in print, I presented a paper at a conference in Liverpool. I was in my first year of my PhD program, and I had the cheek to stand up in front of this community of very established textual scholars and express my opinion and disagree with some of the textual scholars who were sitting in that room. And Tom was intrigued. He was a very smart, very funny man. And so he came up to me, was intrigued by this kind of young, funny sounding Italian woman who, seemed to have strong opinions in matters that, as you were saying earlier, quite technical. And so Tom said to me, because he kind of related to the paper I presented in, it was 1993, in Liverpool, he said to me, that sounds all very interesting. He said, why don't you go and find me an editor of Shakespeare before Nicholas Rowe? Because my paper was about editorial intervention in an adapted text of King Lear that was adapted and written by Nahum Tate and then published in 1681. So Tom was really intrigued by that paper and said, why don't you go and find me editors of Shakespeare before Nicholas Rowe? And I thought, of course, that's what I'm doing. That's the larger question. And I think that's the first job of a teacher. That's the first job of a tutor. You take someone's work, because I was looking with blinkers, at a very, very specific point. I made a very specific argument, and he helped me to develop it. And that's where my early work that then I published in the book called Shakespeare and the Rise of the Editor, that's where my passion and my interest for the early transmission of Shakespeare's texts came from. And I found, indeed, of course, because nothing happens in a vacuum, I found that before editors became public figures, so before they put their names on the title page next to Shakespeare's name, they were already preparing the kind of copy for press. They were just preparing copy according to different methods and principles. Actually, we can't really speak about methods. So nothing was done systematically to the text of the plays. The poems have a different kind of editorial traditions, but they were certainly preparing copy for press. And so I by kind of spending an inordinate amount of time in the British Library. I was by then working in London, teaching in London. I befriended so many curators at the British Library. Some of them have become lifelong friends. I looked at all the early editions and realized that there were patterns. So speech prefixes got tweaked to enhance the clarity for readers of the what used to be a kind of script meant for performance into a written text. Stage directions were added and changed, and occasionally also readings in the dialogue were amended. And so I came up with different names for these correctors of the press. I called them annotating readers, because it's not fair to call them kind of editors, because editors from 1709 onwards started to develop kind of more systematic and accountable methods. But I had great fun, and I really owe that excitement and those findings to Tom, who in a very, Tom was North American and had an outrageous sense of humor. And I owe that part of my professional life and my research to Tom, because he had the grace. He was not my official tutor, but he had the generosity and the inspiration to have a chat with me after that presentation at that conference. And then we were obviously stayed in touch after that. And I just followed up that question that he asked me back in 1993.
Well, this just points to the importance of mentorship in the profession, not just ours, but anywhere. But in my experience too, something can happen in a conversation that just something can be said incidentally that you pick up on, and there's an entire career. And what you, at the time that you saw that, this was unexplored terrain. And so there you had it, and you look and you go, I can do this for a long time, and it needs to be done. I have a reason to be in this profession, right?
Yeah, it took me 14 years. From 1993, I finished my PhD, which was on a slightly different topic, and then I picked up again that lead. And it took me, I mean, my book came out in 2007. So it was a long time coming, but it was fantastic. I basically trained myself as a kind of book historian, textual scholar in those days, back in those days, with Tom kind of teasing me and guiding me along the way. But as you said, Tom, is what it takes for, I think in any profession, although obviously I only know my own profession, but that's what it takes for someone who's been in the profession for longer than a younger researcher to go to the younger researcher who's doing really interesting work already and just say, look at the wider picture. This is your direction of travel. And so that's why Tom was such an inspiration for me, both as an editor and as a textual scholar, but also as a mentor. It was quite literally life-changing, meeting Tom back in Liverpool in 1993.
Yeah, we're getting into a narrow area even for Shakespeareans in some cases, but it's one that I love because when you talk to the older scholars, if they're nice people like Tom, then all of them have had the experience that they are traveling down this road and they have to stay focused on the course they're on, because everyone's on, there's a long arc from inception to publication. We are not like these folks in the sciences and my colleagues in social sciences who can sort of gun out from a laboratory research, all of these. It's a long arc. And along the way, they see many different things that they don't have time, and they know they never will have time to examine. And then when that younger scholar, capable younger scholar comes along, they go, well, here you are. You know, if you need a place, you know, it's just like right outside this little whiskey town in Oklahoma, there's an area over here that you really need to take a look at because it's important, but I don't have time for it. Isn't that something? And it's a
It-
great, it's a sense of exploration. It really is, you know.
And now that I'm older and I've edited for quite some time, I'm still editing. I'm editing Richard III for Arden 4, but I'm also one of the two general editors of a new series, the Cambridge Shakespeare editions, that has just been contracted by Cambridge, and will produce another scholarly edition of Shakespeare, which we hope is going to be quite diverse and different,
Very good.
while building on the traditional scholarship.
Yeah.
And this is how I guess the two or three, as you said right at the beginning, kind of areas of my research interest kind of link up and connect, because I was lucky. I met Tom, but I become aware of the fact that editing and textual studies is one of the least diversified subfields in Shakespeare studies, in academia more generally. And so I am deeply invested, as I was with the Shakespeare book on Shakespeare's accents. I'm really invested, and so are my fellow general editors, N.J. Kidney and Gillian Woods. We are incidentally the first all-female team of general editors of Shakespeare, because the field is, or used to be, predominantly white and male, and scholars affiliated with very select institutions, academic institutions in the West. And even in this field, we are trying to instill an understanding of editing that, yes, it's technical, but it's also philosophical. It's part of the way you edit is informed by a practical method, which in turn is informed by ideas that have to do with who you believe you're editing. So what do you think Shakespeare was, what kind of author Shakespeare was, man of letter, man of the theater, what it is that you're doing when you're editing, whose voice, whose authority you're trying to establish. These are all questions that are really philosophically loaded, and they are answered differently depending on who's editing. So for Shakespeare editing and textual studies to move into the 20th century, it's fundamental that we produce significantly diverse editions, so that they're more appealing and accessible to a wider readership, but also prepared by more diverse scholars. Who may be put off from the idea that, as you were saying, editing is perceived as kind of quite technical and quite arcane, and that you might feel that your editing is not for you unless you were trained and brought up by an established scholar. Now, it was complete serendipity for me. Meeting Tom was chance, and I felt very lucky because he gave me the confidence to get started. But now that I've edited for years, again, I'm thinking, what can I do to encourage other people who may have been in my position, or might be in my position now, as in not even being English speakers, not being white male and trained at a select university. All of that all of those features describe me. But I had that kind of lucky break. I met Tom, but not everybody can rely on meeting, Tom. So what can we do as editors to invite other scholars that may not think of editing as something for them to edit, so that
yes. So you see, this is spot on here, because of course I'm in Japan, and so I'm in a non-native speaking environment a lot of my waking day, and the ability of my students and my colleagues in the Shakespeare Society and so forth, they may not feel comfortable doing a Lacanian reading of this or that. I don't feel in my native tongue. It seems a little bit just a little too obtuse for me, but these are people who are extraordinarily drawn to detail and can do this kind of work that needs to be done. And that's not just in Japan, that's globally. And people, and it's a perfect area for people who are out of their, in a non-native situation. Where they may not want to write the next great, work of interpreting Shakespeare, whatever that would be. I don't know what that would be, but this is the work that needs to be done. And it needs to be done. A lot more needs to be done. And there are all kinds of people out there who can do it and do it well.
Absolutely. And if more diverse people get to edit,
globally across the world, yes.
And if more diverse scholars get to edit Shakespeare, we will all benefit from that, because we will get different insights, a wider range of insights into what a particular line or speech might mean, because people come from a different background, different linguistic and cultural contexts, and they will see different things in those lines.
Yes.
So it's about acknowledging, even in textual editing, in editing textual studies, which is quite traditionally conservative field, is the importance of acknowledging that there is nothing set in stone about Shakespeare's text. Shakespeare's text is extremely unstable. It's the product of editorial labor. And so it will read differently, not just the notes that explain what something means, but even the words themselves that will look quite differently if someone else comes along and has a different sensitivity to the etymology of a word or the origin of a word. And so we all stand to gain a great deal, because otherwise the kind of scholarly editions of Shakespeare tend to look pretty much all the same.
Yes.
Whereas what certainly with the Cambridge Shakespeare editions, what we're trying to do is to commission diversely, but also to, we have envisioned a series that will open up the kind of knowledge we've inherited about Shakespeare through the editorial apparatus. So we are trying to invite different scholars to edit from a different starting point, constructing an apparatus around the text that will encourage those who pick up the editions and read them, or want to maybe stage them in the theater, not to take what they find in the book or the digital edition as objective knowledge, but as an interpretation, something that the editors produces. And we are encouraging, and we will encourage editors to involve the reader or the theater director to continue that work of interpretation, so that it's more, editions will become more representative of kind of the global community that works with Shakespeare and plays with Shakespeare. Because at the moment we've got this paradox that only a very small number of scholars get to edit Shakespeare, and the world reads Shakespeare. And you think, why should such a uniform and select and limited number of people mediate Shakespeare for the rest of the world? Let's get the rest of the world to collaborate in this process of remediation of Shakespeare's works, so that Shakespeare's works start breathing. We breathe new life into them, and they become more inspiring, accessible to more people. Trying to explode this sense that Shakespeare can only mean something, and then you communicate what you think Shakespeare means to the rest of the world. No, Shakespeare only signifies within a community of readers and interpreters, and the interpretation and the reading will change accordingly to who's doing the reading. So we need to make sure that we storm that castle.
Well, I think that the castle will want to be stormed at some point, because you need person power. We said person hours. There are a lot of hours that go into this. And particularly if we're in the digital age and have been for a long time, and there is that to consider and be done also. I'm involved in a bit of that myself, and over too much over the past weekend. And it was tedious. I'm thinking, if I just had we have students who work on it, but they were busy doing other things. I wanted to also emphasize your work. I spoke with earlier with Heidi Craig,
Oh, yeah.
who's because we're trying to get younger career scholars in this, and I was thinking about her when you were talking about younger scholars, and she's with the World Shakespeare Bibliography, and there is in development a digital Paratext initiative that I think that you're very much involved with. And for people who may not know, when we say Paratext, we mean those things, the embroidery, let's not use that, the embroidery, but also the way in which a text, a book, or any production is framed in terms of the graphics, the preface, the images that are included in it, the things that we see in the first folio, how that introductory material frames the order of the plays, all of this stuff, that, the hermeneutics of interpretation that this editor that you've looked into, what they want to do, and the ability to just be able to search out paratext in rare books that we may not, be within hand's reach, right? So tell us a little bit about that project, if you could.
It, again, is something professionally and personally so relevant for me, and certainly my career trajectory. Tom and I edited an edition of Paratexts for Cambridge University Press. Sadly, Tom passed away just shortly after that edition was published. And it was shortly after Tom passed away that I met Heidi, who was working on Paratexts from the Restoration period, taking on what Tom had taught me and the work we'd done together. And then I had the chance to meet Heidi, this brilliant young scholar. And we not only decided to join forces so that we would have all the paratexts up to 1642, but now up to 1660. 1642 to 1660 is Heidi's area of research interest. But also we are currently working on moving that bank of data from print to a database. And I am so grateful to Heidi, not because she's expanding, not only because she's expanding the kind of the time range for that project, but also because she's in the driving seat as it comes to negotiating the transmission from print to digital, which, hands up, I'm at the receiving end. So I'm a user of databases. The knowledge that goes into creating databases is quite extraordinary. That's something that I have not done personally. I'm just collaborating with Heidi. We are trying to work out together how best to present all those texts that, yes, as you were saying, affect the reader's experience of some key canonical texts, including Shakespeare, but also other early modern dramatists. But how to do that so that all that data is accessible and clear and reusable digitally. And Heidi is really quite extraordinary. As you said, she's also in charge of the Shakespeare World Bibliography and the early modern dramatic paratexts, shortened as MDeep. Is a resource that we launched earlier this year at the Shakespeare Association of America conference, and was very warmly received. And we have plans to relaunch a slightly different version in April next year. So for me, that's the future. For me, it goes beyond me. It will go beyond my personal trajectory. Heidi, when I take on and move way beyond what I could reach myself personally. So that's very exciting for me.
Sonia, you need everybody in, and I said this in a prior show, but I'll say it again because I kind of like it. It makes me feel smart. But my wife and I, we spend a lot of time in Barcelona. She has family. We were both married before, but anyhow, I spent not lately, but and in Barcelona, in Italy, in any of these places, when you see the Sagrada Familia, and you see the other older churches, the Basilica
Yeah,
of Santa
yeah,
Maria del Mar, and you look and you just wonder, it's just a wondrous achievement. It's a church that people have not heard of that much outside, and you wander around and you go up to Montjuic in Barcelona and you see this big cruise ship going in. It just sort of entered my country boy mind. I'm going, who builds these things? These ships, these cathedrals, and how do you do this? And it just hit me then and said, a lot of people
yeah,
build these
yeah,
things,
yeah,
and you need everybody, right?
yeah,
So the guy who knows how to do plumbing doesn't know a thing about how to lay carpet or to do tile
right,
floors or to build walls, and you have to have everybody.
yeah,
And people develop their own specialties. So that's what I love about the project that you're doing. In affiliation with the Folger, I like to shout out to the Folger whenever I
yeah,
can,
yes,
and Heidi's
absolutely.
involvement with that, taking on that enormous task with the bibliography and so forth. And also, I
Not
wanted
only
to say that I found years ago, I was in bibliography, but I would go to these big conferences and I'd see these papers, and it was in the middle of this critical theory thing. And I don't poo-poo critical theory. I mean, Foucault meant a lot to me when I was coming up, and a number of these theorists now who are sort of maligned, particularly in more conservative circles, but they opened up the world and so forth. But I would go to these conferences and I did not want to hear another paper that I really couldn't understand, that was written for a reader who would have to really spend a lot of time for it. And I would always go to the bibliography or textual studies, and there'd be three people in there and there'd be three people reading. and almost invariably, two of the three papers were fabulous, just fabulously exciting, and so
Yes, there is something really satisfying about working with words. So obviously critical theory works with big ideas and has a huge impact on how we read texts. So as you said, not to knock it at all, but there's something really immediate and satisfying about working with words, and it's printed words or manuscript words. So you're actually looking at objects. So what you're looking at is a material history. And then, of course, the way you're reading those objects is informed by the same big ideas that the critical theorists use in their field. But in the field of textual studies and book history, those ideas are applied to object. So it's an object. So it's quite satisfying.
Yeah.
For example, when you look at Paratexts, all these texts that introduce a play or maybe come after the play, and you look at them, how materially they affect your experience of that text. One of my favorite examples is to go back to Troilus and Cressida, the fact that there are two issues, both published in 1609, one that refers to the play as a play, the other one who seems to shy away from the commercial stage and draws the reader's attention to its classical heritage. Yeah. So like Shakespeare, like a modern classic. So one going for the commercial appeal, the theatrical appeal, one going for this is a play. It looks like a play, but it's not a play. It's a literary text. It's a kind of, classical text. And it's fabulous because you're not just speculating about how you might want to read Troilus and Cressida, which is totally legitimate, but you're grounding your reading of Troilus and Cressida in material features of the early editions. And so of course, you still speculate, but you speculate on the basis of evidence that can tell us stories about how Troilus and Cressida was read by others. So I'm also personally very, very excited by the idea that we can listen to earlier generations and understand how maybe they understood Shakespeare. So I'm very much historicist in my approach to Shakespeare, even when it comes to the present. I want to see the present as part of a longer paradigm. So yeah, hooray for textual studies.
Yeah. Now I had one little story where it doesn't have to do with Shakespeare. It was a paper on Ray Bradbury, the science fiction writer who was very popular in his time, and it still is. And this guy had done research on Ray Bradbury, and he wrote the famous book, The Martian Chronicles. And they were really just a series of chapters. And he could do short stories, but he couldn't do novels. So he goes to New York, and he doesn't have that much money. So he stays in the YMCA, and he goes and talks to the publisher. And he said, listen, if you can arrange chapters in a way that makes this seem like a novel, we'll publish it as a novel. And then the speaker, and I forgot his name, came back. He said he went back to the YMCA and he made a list of chapters that's not followed in succeeding editions, right? He said, and I know he made this list of chapters in the YMCA at that time, what is 1957, whenever. And he said, because here's the paper. He had the paper that Bradbury wrote, and those sorts of
things. The list of chapters built the novel.
Yes. So if you want to argue how to arrange chapters, this is what he said at first. It might not be the best way, but
that's the paratext. The paratext constructing the text.
That's it. That's it. It's fabulous. And it's just the kind of revelation that you have in the British Library frequently, where you can see this. And it puts you at one point, now this might sound a little flaky, but you can feel those people and what they were doing, even down to
to transfer your story to a Shakespearean context. You could say that Shakespeare was put together as a literary author by the people who published him, both as individual plays with their individual paratexts, but of course in 1623, when Hemingway and Condell commissioned the stationers to produce something as monumental as the first folio. You could say that Shakespeare had the short stories, but the people who created the novel were not Shakespeare. And they weaved the plays together. For example, the history plays are not as like such a kind of clear sequence as they appear to be in the folio, because they have different titles that were written at different times, not as a sequence. And they are rearranged into a sequence in the folio so that the history plays look like a cycle, but they were not written as a cycle.
No.
So
in fact, reverse. They were in reverse order. It's incredibly,
The second trilogy, what we call this, that was actually written first. So the Henry VI and Richard III were written first, and then came Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V. So it's fantastic. Your stories applies to Shakespeare completely.
Well, I don't want to miss your work, and it's fairly recent, and we can't. And I want to make sure I pronounce this correctly. Ivo van Hove, is that right? Ivo van Hove. Ivo van Hove, for those who might not be familiar, is very well known within the circles of the avant-garde theater. But I mean, he's a pioneer. He has done things off Broadway and taking these chances, where things, sometimes off Broadway is where things just go to die, and people get disappointed and they get frustrated, and they're still working their day jobs or they're as waiters and so forth, and things are not. But he just keeps plowing through and getting it, and here and there these things click, and he gets on. And he was one of the final people who kind of, his work is sort of, among others, is sort of a eulogy to David Bowie's life and career, isn't it? Because he was there at the finale. And so you have written a book, and he has contributed to the book, and explain some of that to us, because I'm going to say something wrong pretty soon here. This is
that was another magical moment. I got to talk to Ivo after a platform at the Barbican, after his premiere of Roman Tragedies, because I was editing Tis Pity. She's a horror, and I knew that he had directed Tis Pity, and so I just asked him if I could access the archives, that I could find production photos from all the production. And then, of course, we talked about Roman Tragedies. And so I got to know him and his partner, Jan Versbebelt, who designs what they together call their alternative realities. And that's how you experience Ivo and Jan's work. It's so emotional, intellectually stimulating, but also emotional, because you quite literally, they have the power together to create these alternative realities where theater suddenly really matters. So I think the secret of Ivo's success is that people might think of Ivo as experimental, and therefore, as you said, quite obscure and out there and not for me. Ivo wants to reach people. He says that he
has reached very many.
So the musical, absolutely, the homage to Bowie.
Lazarus, I guess, the final,
so he's experimental, but he's not elitist in his work. He's the opposite. He wants to take his work to as many people as possible. And he does that because of the power that he infuses, the creative power that he infuses in all of his work. He's a really exciting director to watch, and Jan is an amazing designer. You never forget Ivo's productions. You come out of the theater a different person. I am not exaggerating. After watching Roman Tragedies, which is 6 hours long without an interval, so you're kind of allowed. There are moments when you could call them brief intermissions, but they're so brief that you're bound to kind of miss some of that show. And Ivo wanted to induce that sense of everything happening all the time and that you can't keep up with what's happening, because Roman Tragedies, an adaptation of Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and Antony and Cleopatra, it's meant to conjure the experience of kind of politics in the 21st century, world events, and how we feel, because of digital media and social media, that we feel connected all the time, that we should know everything immediately, and actually we are maybe more disempowered than we were before the advent of social media. So it was mind-blowing. I didn't take that. I didn't expect that. I went to see what I thought was a modern dress adaptation of the Roman Tragedies. I came out and I struggled to find my way home. Literally, I nearly went the wrong way on the tube, because my mind was on fire, because it made me think about the way in which I access information, what I do with that information, if that empowers me as a citizen of a kind of seemingly democratic country. And I mean, that doesn't, I don't mean the UK or Italy. It's the alternative reality applied to all kind of postmodern kind of first world countries where people have the privilege of being able to access information in real time. Of course, that doesn't apply worldwide. So Ivo has, I think, one of the most kind of powerful connection with the world, not just of the work of Shakespeare, but the classics in general. He seemed to be able to reimagine the classics as burningly contemporary. And that is not in a reductive way, if you know what I mean. That encounter was absolutely fateful. And I'm going to mention someone else, without whom that book would not have been possible. Susan Bennett,
yes.
Theatre Studies and professor in Shakespearean, another wonderful colleague, collaborator. And it was Susan who, I was writing about Ivo here and there, and it was Susan who said, we need a book on Ivo. He's becoming so prominent. And so again, I was very lucky. I was talking to this wonderful colleague of mine who said, let's talk to Ivo. And so I emailed Ivo and I said, having finished my work on TSPT, how about we come and talk to you in Amsterdam about a project that focuses on your work? And Ivo, in kind of half jokingly, half seriously, said, it's about time that you guys wrote a book about my work.
Yeah. So it merged at the right time. Well,
yeah.
What I'm gathering about this, along with the fact that I really, really want to see I've never seen a production, a Van Hove production. I would really, I'm very much addicted when I'm in London, even from being very young, to any theater. And if it's off West End, whatever, a little kind of burnt out place on Tottenham Court Road, where I remember there was a little theater that did Beckett that I will never forget. And we've been in a period of time where I'm hoping that we will survive this and be able to go back to the theater and have that experience. But very importantly, and we have set up a theme that I didn't have in the agenda about generational production of this and and helping others along and collaborating and so forth. And you talked about just walking up and asking, right? And so I contacted you out of the blue. We haven't met at conferences.
Yes.
And so anytime I do that, I'm expecting a scholar to say, Tom, listen, I'm just busy. I don't know what you're doing, this little podcast over in Tokyo, and knock yourself out, and maybe later. And nobody does. People just say yes.
You just need to ask.
You just ask. You just walk up and ask. And I've always done that. Now, not always have I been received well, but I've always said, if you don't ask, you will not receive.
Absolutely.
Not exactly.
And I'm so glad I asked Ivo, I met him, I asked him, and then wonderful things came out of that fateful encounter. Before we move away from that, I wanted to say, since you mentioned the fact that you'd like to watch Ivo in action, that you can. One of the kind of good things to come out of the absolute devastation that has been COVID is the fact that Ivo has predictably led the way in organizing live streaming of his productions. So they broadcast as they happen in Amsterdam. If you look up International Turner Group Amsterdam, ITA, ITA.nl for Netherlands, you can reserve a ticket and then log on. And it's, of course, not the same as being in the theater. But something else I've become very passionate about during the lockdown is the fact that Shakespeare has become networked and has actually opened up access. Yeah. So I couldn't go to Amsterdam this Sunday, but I'll be tuning in and I'll be watching it from London if I'm back in London by Sunday. Yeah. Ivo is also a visionary when it comes to, again, reaching out to people, even at times when it's been challenging for people to go to theaters. And he has encouraged other world directors to do the same. I listened into a roundtable that he participated in during the second lockdown or the first lockdown, hosted by the Festival Theatre in Tokyo. I can share the link with that. I think it's still online, where he was saying to the other directors, the financial model is very simple. You only need a TV crew in the theater to work with your actors in the morning. They will film the production live for you and you can then broadcast it. And if you do that and you sell the tickets online, which are cheaper than the tickets you sell for live performance, with maybe half of the people in the theater, or no people at all. At the beginning, he had no one in the theater. He can still, he said, you can either break even or actually make a profit. So I really like that about Ivo, because he's a visionary, but he's also really practical. And his aim has always been to reach out to people. Yeah, by all means, to go back to your point, ask, approach anybody, anyone.
And we'll get all of this. We'll get this information up on screen. We do this as a podcast also, but we'll make sure the information is widely available for my people over here. But it turns out that it's not over here as much as it's part of the world. Anything that you put out there. I did want to talk with you, sort of not in closing quite yet, but I did want to talk with you about "'Tis Pity." I have a student who came, 2 years ago. She came in and said, and polite young woman who said, you're the Shakespeare guy here, and I want to work on "'Tis Pity She's a Whore."
Oh.
And I said, well, oh, okay, but I'm, my Ford is a little rusty, if there was ever, anything, but I'm pretty good Webster, and we have our people, and I'm thinking, okay, what do you want to look at? She said, I'd like to look at marriage. I would like to look at law. And so I had to get an education from Sonia Massai first, your edition of "'Tis Pity," and also look into marital law in England, and also into incest. And so I'm completely red-faced when I'm having to tutor her, and also other graduate students, because I said, okay, well, incest is a big deal. It's a big deal. Now this is incest, whereas, in Henry VIII and that whole business of whether or not his wife actually slept with his brother or whatever, consummated the marriage. But it's been just wonderful. Actually, it's just opened up all of this. And thank you for that addition. I don't think that was the first thing people were running for when you started. You must have started much earlier. I think, did it come out about 10 years ago? Is that right?
Yeah, 2011, I think.
Yeah. And so you started far sooner than that. And so it might have not been the most attractive play to go. But did you not feel the same way? And I felt like he was.
Yes, no, I also didn't expect to empathize quite so much with Annabella and Giovanni, the brother and sister who have the incestuous affair in the play. It was only when I started working on it, and I was commissioned to edit it. I didn't have a choice.
Oh, really? Oh, it was.
We'd like you to edit "'Tis Pity," and I think it was a very interesting choice. The series editors, John Jowett, Susan Gossett, and Gord McMullen, another shout out.
Yeah.
They knew my work as an editor, and they knew that my background, the setting of "'Tis Pity" had never been looked at seriously. And I, coming from a training in Italy, is very strong kind of background in the humanities and the kind of Renaissance humanism and civic humanism that Ford is steeped into. I recognized some features of the play that other editors had not noticed really spoke to me. And what I found, which made the play so interesting to me, and I hope I did the play justice, because I don't think John Ford wanted to write something that people would be horrified by. I think he wanted to play something that would really shock them into thinking differently about marriage, about politics. So what he did, by setting that play in Parma, evoked an ideal of self-governance. So an idea of incest not as a moral sin, but as a political statement. So Giovanni is initially likable because he wants to assert his own right to keep himself to himself and Annabella to himself, because they are surrounded by pretty unlikely characters. And Parma is surrounded by pretty dangerous powers, secular and spiritual, emperors and popes. And Parma is Giovanni and Annabella, is a mercantile city-state. And the ideal of civic humanism was for these city-states, like the Renaissance man that Giovanni is, to retain their autonomy. It was a marvelous ideal. It makes me cry, the perfection of Parma. Parma means shield. And it had the round structure of a Roman shield, and it had the perfection of a geometrical ideal, because it's just perpendicular, intersecting roads. Everything was planned to reflect this kind of ideal state of reason and balance and autonomy. So the trick, Ford makes you care so much about Giovanni and Annabella because they are wonderful. They are idealists. They're basically Romeo and Juliet.
They're Romeo and Juliet.
Comes from Romeo and Juliet. And it's so outrageous because you are made to cheer them on. And then you think, they're brother and sister. But that's the trick. That's tragedy, right?
Yeah.
And so Ford was giving the British, the English, a prime example of classical tragedy, of incest tragedy, a la Oedipus Rex, what Sophocles done for the Greeks. He wanted to do for the English. And so I found a lot of beauty in it. I wasn't horrified at all. And I then started to teach it to my own students who will come to class, just wanting to hide behind their books because they didn't want to hear someone talk about sibling incest. And they would leave the classroom feeling inspired and also really, I think, challenged by the thought that incest, like any other type of sexual desire, is cultural. So we cringe, but the cringing is more cultural than natural. And so I just came to love Tis Pity.
I have to, and we're working a little bit on law. We're trying to anchor things in law because, of course, I feel certain that if you were John Ford, you had to feel the shadow of Shakespeare, the shadow of Johnson, of all of those who preceded you, and you do have to do something new. Your challenge is a sort of Harold Bloom sort of thing, the anxiety of influence you have to overcome. But I don't think it was quite that. It's just, I can't put on Romeo and Juliet again. Right? We've done plenty of that by now, so we've got to look into it. And Romeo and Juliet are questionable. They didn't have witnesses at their marriage. It was questionable whether or not they were really, and they consummated and the whole thing. So you could say there's violation of church law, right? Yeah, and we've looked into this. There is no question that Ferdinand and Annabella, no question.
No, that they were breaking the
rules.
rules.
Breaking the law. And they're not only breaking the law in the sense that, we would be more tolerant about disobedient daughter running off into the woods and maybe, having premarital sex if they managed to get the ceremony in there before any babies came along or whatnot. That would be okay. But in this case, there's no way out. No way. And now and then, we could be more tolerant with, of course, we've had, of course, the women's movement and so forth, but we don't do that either.
We actually now less tolerant.
I think so.
Something, talk about discoveries and the excitement of research. Again, something I did not know before I started working on the edition is that we have become very liberated, as you say, after the 60s and the 70s in terms of sexuality, agency for women, and then diverse sexualities. But we've become, if anything, more entrenched in our sense that incest is unnatural. I'm not questioning the fact that incest breaks some pretty biological also laws in some cases, in some configurations, though not others. I read an article in the Lancet that established pretty firmly, objectively, that in some communities, incest, not sibling but cousin, is a practice that actually it increases the number of infant mortality, but increases fertility in communities where they need a lot of children because maybe they are farming communities. And so the law there is different. And so their perception of what constitutes incest is different from our sense of what constitutes incest. And what I found out is that we have a much stronger reaction that seems to be completely instinctive, whereas something is cultural, than the early moderns did. Because according to the early moderns, sexuality was a manifestation of the fall. So even kind of canonical heterosexual desire embedded in marriage was seen as a necessary evil, only justified by the need for reproduction and transmission of goods and family patrimony. So everything that was sexual, from heterosexuality to heterosexuality without parental consent, so outside marriage, to homosocial, homoerotic, homosexual desire, to incest, were seen as part of one manifestation of our fallen nature as mankind. So paradoxically, incest wasn't seen as more repugnant or more evil. It was yes, more sinful than, say, sex outside marriage, outside wedlock. But it was a matter of degree rather than quality. Whereas, because for us, some sexualities have become accepted and legalized, we have a much stronger reaction to incest than in the early modern period. It would be punished, it would be seen as illegal, but it was part and parcel of human sexuality in a way that it's not for us. And that for me was quite shocking. I didn't
and it probably would have involved younger, kids who we would deem to be too young to be involved in that type of activity anyway. And church law, I think they may have been aware of the fact that if you're going to hold to this Adam and Eve business as the earthly father and mother, and you're going to hold to that, then you cannot have a situation there where we do not come from incestuous relationships. If there are only two. Of course, Cain seems to find some people outside, so it's a little bit vague there, but
it's very interesting when it comes to the Bible and how the Bible defines incest, because it's defined differently in different books. So you
not very clear.
What is incest and what isn't then? In one book of the Bible, adultery is classified as incest. And you think, come again? And that's because the community that book, we think, was written for was nomadic. And so they had to police the boundaries, not only between blood relations or acquired, in-laws, but also about people who quite literally slept, in tents next to each other, and they had to regulate
and who were related, very likely related.
Totally, they were probably likely related, but the relation seems to be less important than the physical proximity. So the physical proximity constituted incest. So it's really, really, really eye-opening. And you think it has to do with space, less with biology or religion. It's to do with space, how you manage space. So sexual relations to manage resources and access to space. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating. And Ford's fascinating too, just saying, I'm going to give this play this title, which had to attract attention, raise eyebrows. Let's just start out, this is going to be...
You should have seen the eyebrows on the tube, the London Underground, while I was working on this project. And I had, 20 different editions of this PT with the title printed on the cover. And people would just stop. And it was an intake of breath and kind of, very, very twitching eyebrows.
Oh, that's just wonderful.
I have actually a wonderful story to tell about the title. I wanted an original map of Parma to show that wonderful circular architecture design for that city-state. And the best map is in the Vatican museums. So I called the Vatican museums because I wanted to ask for permission to reproduce one of the maps that they have there. And when I said what I was working on, the person in the Vatican Museum just repeated the title out loud in Italian. And they went, "Peccato fosse cosa? Ti spiti, she was what?" And it kind of echoed because they must have been in a big room. And thankfully they said that because I think they were just about to slam the phone down. But because they started to say that title out loud, thankfully there was an English graduate from La Sapienza in Rome at the other side of the desk and said, I know what that's about. It's okay. It's not, you know, it's not soft porn. It's a canonical play by a canonical English playwright. And that did the trick. But the title was going to make my life very hard if it wasn't for the fact that someone recognized it.
Keep you from gaining entree there, right? 'Tis pity. Well, that's great, and I think that we have gotten through the agenda here, and I just, and there are so many other things I would love to talk about. I would love to talk about the you know, experience that you had going from Italy to, and you know, you can't, you say yes, you're Italian, but in Italy it matters so much where you're from. And I'm not saying it matters more than being from Liverpool or being from London or what, you know, it might be the, but the history of Italy, of course, it has the, you know, when you go to a separate region, separate state, you get into separate feelings of identity that are very, very strong. I'd love to explore that, but that would take us a lot longer than probably time that you have today. What I would like to do is ask you to stay a little bit afterwards to debrief just a moment, if I may.
Yes.
And we're going to stop recording now, but not before I thank you on behalf of my university, Aoyama Gakuin University in Tokyo, and the JSPS, the people who fund this, who have been very, very helpful. And the staff at my university to help do this. I wanted to have a symposium, and of course, you know, we couldn't do that. And also to my friends in the Shakespeare Society of Japan, who will be very, very interested in hearing from you and being able to meet you virtually as a person, see you as a person, and not as just a name on a text.
My heartfelt thanks for having me on this. It's a lovely initiative. I feel privileged to be on this, so thank you.
Well, it was a privilege for us to have you, and the pleasure is all ours, Sonia. Thank you so much.